I said my sermon today is about God's holy days. Because the Feast of Pentecost is coming next week. So I thought I'd give a little background, because to me, the holy days, which I first learned about back in 1960, are so exciting, so thrilling, so wonderful, that you cannot wait for the time when everybody would keep them. And when Jesus returns, we know. In fact, I didn't put that on my notes. I don't always stick to my notes. But if we go to Zechariah 14, do you know Zechariah 14? One time I visited somebody and there were some people there and they were going to argue with me. And they wanted to argue about these holy days. And I said to the man, "Do you believe Zechariah?" He said, "Sure, I believe Zechariah." Then I flipped to Zechariah. Then I realized he didn't know Zechariah very well because he couldn't find it. Zechariah, it's almost at the end of the Old Testament. Malachi is the last book. Zechariah is the second to last book. Zechariah 14. While the man was flipping to Zechariah trying to find it, I said to him, "Oh, can't you find it?" He said, "It's not a book I go to very often." I said, "Well, actually, there are quite a few books in the Bible you don't go to very often." He didn't like me very much. But there are lots of books we don't get to very often. So sometimes we need to turn there. Zechariah 14, let's talk about Jesus Christ returning. In that day, his feet will stand upon the Mount of Olives. So we know what it's talking about. Verse 4, his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. And here's a picture of the returning Jesus Christ coming back to Jerusalem, the thing that so many millions of Christians around the world are looking forward to. And he will be king over all the earth, verse 9. Then verse 12 says, "And this is the plague wherewith the Lord shall smite all the people that are fought against Jerusalem." So you can read all that. Verse 16, "And it shall come to pass that every one that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem." So Jesus returns. He destroys these armies. The king is ruling, and it says, here's the first thing that it mentions here about this king ruling. And it says that everyone that is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall even go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep Christmas. No. Easter? No. The Feast of Tabernacles. I don't know about you, but when I first started reading the Bible, I had never heard of it. In fact, I was studying in my Afrikaans Bible, which is like Dutch. I read about Loofhuttenfeest. Now, imagine reading something like that. That sounds bad to you. It just sounded as bad to me. I had no idea what I was talking about. Feast of Tabernacles. I was surprised later on to go to John 7. Let's go to John 7. As these things come to my mind, it is so fascinating. John 7. Here is Jesus. The year before he died. John 7 verse 1, "After these things Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, down in Judea." Why not? Because the Jews wanted to kill him. He knew it. He knew the Jewish leaders were out to kill him. Now it says, now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. Why was it called the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles? Because they were the only ones keeping it. It was not the Greeks' Feast of Tabernacles or the Roman Feast of Tabernacles. Because if you went to Rome, they were keeping the Saturnalia or the Bacchanalia or some other alia, whatever they called their various pagan feasts. No, the Jews were the ones still keeping the Feast of Tabernacles. And if ever there was an excuse for Jesus not to go to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, here was one. They were waiting to kill him. You can read the rest of John 7 and you'll find that despite the fact that they wanted to kill him, Jesus went to the feast. And the Jews said, "Where is he?" They knew he would be there. He wasn't going to miss God's feast. And then he spoke at the feast, and then he stood up on the last great day and spoke on that holy day, the last feast day. So if Jesus, when he returns, teaches people, and that's what I asked this minister person who I was talking to, if Jesus, when he returns, teaches people to keep the Feast of Tabernacles, shouldn't we do that now? And he said, I never thought about that. And that's a good thing to say. I've never thought about that. How many times have you studied the Bible and you would come across something and you think, I never thought about that? That's right, I never thought about that. Well, now we can think about it. But people will say, no, but that's for the Jews. Let's go to 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter. 1 Corinthians. Corinth was a city, the second biggest city in Greece. It's still a big city. My wife and I, we traveled through the Corinthian Canal in a ship. Quite a dramatic trip that was. There's a bridge across the Corinthian Canal, which as the ship approaches, it sinks down. It goes down into the water and disappears. So the ship that we were on had 600 passengers, went over the bridge and then went down this canal with literally just a couple of feet on both sides. In fact, a couple of times we bumped a little bit. That's how narrow this canal is. It's called the Corinthian Canal. The original canal was cut through there centuries ago. So Corinth was a big Greek city. And the Apostle Paul had spent time there, and he had started a church. Then he left there, and then he got some messages from there. Not all of them were good. So he wrote this letter to the Corinthians. So the church was in a Greek-speaking area, it's a Greek church. There were some Jews, but mostly Gentiles. They converted from their pagan religions, which Corinth was full of paganism. It actually was a terrible city. But these people had become converted, become Christians. And here Paul is now writing to these Greeks. And in verse 7, you can read the whole chapter. Of course, I could say, you can read the whole chapter, you can read the whole book, you can read the whole Bible, but we're going to do that all today. So, verse 7, purge out, therefore, the old leaven. Now imagine, this is the Apostle Paul, who would have been considered a Jewish rabbi or Jewish teacher. In fact, he was an eminent teacher. He had been taught by one of the most eminent teachers, Gamaliel. Gamaliel's father had started the Hillel school of Judaism, one of the two greatest schools among the Jews. Saul of Tarsus, as he was called, he grew up in Tarsus, the educational center, one of the educational centers of the Roman Empire. A Jew educated in Tarsus. That's why they called him Saul of Tarsus. Why? Because Tarsus was, most of the teachers of the Caesars came from Tarsus. Just interesting historic sidelights. So here you have this ex-Jewish rabbi writing to Greeks, and look at the language he uses. Purge out therefore the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened. What did that mean to the Greeks? That would have sounded like Greek. Pardon the pun. They wouldn't have understood, unless they knew that there was a festival entitled the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Talk to any Jew, he'll tell you about it. I've kept it for 51 years. Feast of Unleavened Bread. I never knew what it was about. I found out that for 7 days the Israelites ate bread that was not leavened. But look at what Paul says here. As you are unleavened. That meant that the Corinthians must have put leaven out, like the Jews did. Paul gives a reason here, for even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Passover. Isn't Passover something Jewish? Yeah. Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Then he says in verse 8, therefore let us keep the feast. What feast? Well, there's only one feast that's attached to the Passover, and that's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And you can have fun reading these first few chapters of Corinthians. What is leaven? I need to explain. Leaven is something like yeast, which you put in dough that causes bread to rise. If you don't, the bread will be flat and hard and tough to eat. That's what leaven is. Now, leaven is amazing. You put a little bit in it, and it spreads through the whole loaf. I used to be the bread baker in our family. I used to knead the bread the night before, wrap it up in a blanket. Next morning, it's all exploded, big and puffy. I would knead it back down, and then I would divide it into loaves and put them in pans, and I would cycle to school, knowing that while I'm cycling to school, these loaves would start rising, and within half an hour or so, they would be risen nicely, and my mother would put them in the oven and bake them. And when we came back home from school, we'd have this nicely fresh baked bread and put on some apricot jam or fig jam or whatever. So leavening is something that puffs the bread up. What is fun about reading these chapters in Corinthians is that Paul keeps on telling these people that they have problems. He says, you've got problems and you're puffed up. And this and this and that, and you are puffed up. And you think you've got knowledge, but knowledge puffs up. Pride puffs up. Leaven puffs up. So the Apostle Paul uses leavening as a symbol of sin that puffs up. I'm sure we covered some of those scriptures during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but I just want to give a little background here about these holy days that are interesting, that are exciting. Why did Paul write these Corinthians, Greeks, about the Feast of Unleavened Bread? They must have been keeping it. It was important to them. We know in the last chapter of Corinthians the time that Paul wrote this. 1 Corinthians 16, Paul says, and verse 8, he was in Ephesus when he wrote this letter. So he writes to them and he said, I will tarry at Ephesus until Pentecost. Well, you have the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and then some weeks later you have Pentecost. So it tells you that Paul must have written this letter either during the Feast of Unleavened Bread or immediately afterwards. From the wording, it sounds like he wrote it during the feast. Again, why would Paul, the Apostle Paul, that so many say actually did away with a lot of these Jewish things, why would he write to Greeks and tell them about the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Because they're important. Let's go to Luke. The book of Luke. Luke 1. You know, when you read the New Testament, well, when I read the New Testament, I like to dig in and put myself there. You know, it doesn't help me to read the New Testament thinking I'm in Rockwell, Texas, because nothing in Rockwell, Texas is New Testament. I can tell you about Rockwell, the lake where there's no fish. That's never ever happened to me. Let me kill the phone. That's the death knell. I normally switch my phone off, and my wife said to me, did you put your phone on silent? And I thought I put it on silent, but obviously I don't know how to press the right button, so I thought it went on vibrate, but it didn't. That was my daughter who phoned me. I should have left it on. She would have heard the sermon. If you look at the New Testament and you want to understand what Jesus and the disciples did, you need to kind of read there and live into that time. Where was Jesus living? In Palestine, what we call Israel today. And he moved about from where Jerusalem is up to Bethany. He was born in Bethlehem, which is over there. You know, you can look on a map. Bethlehem is actually in the area of the West Bank, Palestinian area today. That's where Jesus spent time. He would have walked north through Samaria, which is the area of Samaria, occupied by the Samaritans who didn't like the Jews. And then he would have gone up to Galilee, which is next to the Sea of Galilee, which is up toward Lebanon on today's map, but not quite into Lebanon, just south. That's where Jesus walked. That's where he had his ministry. That's the focus of the Gospels. So if you start in the book of Luke, and the reason why I choose Luke is because he kind of put the whole thing in time sequence. So instead of talking about Jesus, he starts talking about John the Baptist, who came before Jesus. But look at the picture of Luke 1, verse 5. Luke says in the beginning of his book, well, I'm writing this because I have full understanding of what happened. He said, verse 5, the paragraph starts there. There was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zacharias, of the course of Abijah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord blameless. Imagine if God could say that of you. They walked in all the commandments and ordinances of God blameless. These were good people. These were righteous people. Zacharias was a priest. He was in the temple, doing duty as a priest according to the course of Abijah. And if you want to be technical, that was the 8th course, way back in the Old Testament. The sons of Aaron, who were the priests, were assigned when to do duty at the temple. They were divided into several groups, and Abijah was the 8th group. So you can actually figure out when Zacharias was in the temple. This is fascinating, because if you can figure that out, because the angel told Zacharias, your wife is going to have a child, and you must call him John, so you can figure out when John the Baptist was born. And then if you read a little further, you find that when Elizabeth, that's John the Baptist's mother, was 6 months pregnant, the angel appeared to Mary and said, you will have a child. So then you can figure out, guess what? John the Baptist was born, and Jesus was born about 6 months later. Why? Because his mother, John's mother, was 6 months pregnant when Mary came and said, I'm going to have a baby. Easy. So when you have a little technical background, that's not hidden knowledge. I have books in my library at home that have been written years ago by scholars about the course of Abijah. And you can figure out that Jesus must have been born somewhere in the fall. September, October. Right? And if you were over in England 50 years ago, 30 years ago, you would have heard of Michaelmas. Anybody here ever heard of Michaelmas? Our Australian friend, my wife. Michaelmas. It's an old Christian church festival in England, Michaelmas, commemorating the time, they said, when the angels appeared to the shepherds and told them that the child was going to be born. When is Michaelmas? September, October. You know, it's been there for years. I'll tell you how long it's been, how long I've known about Michaelmas. See, I went to school in South Africa. So when I was in elementary school in South Africa, we used to have a holiday September, October. And here I was speaking Afrikaans and Zulu and English, but in my Afrikaans language, saying in Afrikaans, we are going, that would have been in Afrikaans, on Michaelmas. And I used the English, because that's the only name we had for it. It was the Michaelmas holiday. And we had the Michaelmas holiday every year because they didn't have semesters, they had terms. They had 4 terms, and it broke between the one term and the next term at Michaelmas. It was the Michaelmas holiday. All those years we went on a holiday at Michaelmas. And nobody ever figured out. Nobody ever told me. You know where Michaelmas came from? I only found that out about 15 years ago, that I finally looked up Michaelmas and, the Mass of St. Michael, as they call it, because they believe it's maybe true, maybe not true, we don't know, that it was Michael the archangel who came to the shepherds, where Gabriel was the one that came to Mary. We don't know, but that's their tradition. I'm saying the tradition's been there for how long? For centuries. Now when we come along and tell people, Jesus could not have been born in December. Oh, how can you say that? No, it's been said for years. Most churches know it. My wife and I went to visit an old man. He was 74 years, he and his wife, down in South Africa. He was really upset. I said, Wum is for uncle. Among the Afrikaner people, everybody who's older than you is Wum. Wum, why are you so angry? He said, because these ministers have been lying to me. Well, here I was sitting. I was a minister. I said, why? He said, well, I found out that Jesus was not born on the 25th of December. I said, yes. He said, and he was an elder in the Dutch Reformed Church, so immediately he called for the ministers of the church to come and visit him. Now, an elder in the Dutch Reformed Church, they kind of run the church. They're the old people. And so 2 ministers and their assistants came to visit Uncle Jerry, as some people called him. And he said to them, I have heard that Jesus was not born 25th of December. And the minister said, oh, we all know that. You should have known Jerry, Uncle Jerry. He said, you knew about it? And you never told me? I went to your church Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. You knew about it. You didn't tell me. I had to listen to this American preacher on the radio, and he told me? Oh, he was upset. Phew. Interesting. When you look at the New Testament, what's the setting of the New Testament? When would Jesus have gone to church? On the Jewish Sabbath, right? Why? Because that's when everybody else went to church. That's when they went to the temple. That's when they went to the synagogue. So we know it was as his custom was. Let's go to Luke 4. We need to read the scriptures for what they say, not for what we've dreamt up in the past 2,000 years. Luke 4, verse 16. Picture this. He came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. Wait a bit. You may have read this before, but you didn't think about it. Jesus walked into a synagogue. There were rabbis at the synagogue. Every Sabbath they read from the law and from the prophets. They had a certain religious service that they all followed. And here's Jesus. Walks in, sits down, and it says here, there was delivered unto him the book of the prophet Isaiah. The leader of the synagogue turned to this Jesus of Nazareth, who some people thought is just a nobody. Have you read that Jesus was some poor carpenter from Nazareth? Well, picture this poor carpenter from Nazareth, he's in the synagogue. The leader of the synagogue, he turns to Jesus and he has the scroll of Isaiah rolled open to a specific scripture, which was the reading for that day, and he hands it to Jesus to read. Why did that happen? What does that tell you about Jesus? Anybody here ever been in a Jewish synagogue? Some of you have. I've been there quite a few times. We lived in a Jewish area. I had many Jewish friends that invite me to attend a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah or whatever else. As soon as a man, sorry ladies, as soon as a man walks into a Jewish synagogue, you will find that people are looking at you and somebody's whispering about you. You know, when I walked in there, I had my suit on and I had my little yamurka. I had a little Jewish hat. Because they don't know who I am, so they find out who I am. And I guess my friends would have just told him, he's my friend, he's a Christian. Because the question is he fluent in Hebrew? Because you know what? If I had been fluent in Hebrew, guess what would have happened that day? They would have called on me to read the reading for that day. That's how they do things. Can you see now why, when Jesus walked into the synagogue, they turned to him and they delivered the book to him? Why? Jesus was important. Why was he important? Everybody knew he was the son of David. He was of the royal family. Everybody knew Jesus was a teacher. They called him rabbi. Remember Mary, after they'd gone to the tomb was empty, and everybody left, and Mary Magdalene was hanging around by the tomb, and she saw somebody and she thought he was a gardener. And then when she realized it was Jesus, what did she shout out? Rabboni, which means what? My teacher. Was Jesus a teacher? You bet he was. He was the son of David. He was a very important man. Very important. People don't realize that. That's another sermon. That's an exciting part of Jesus' background that most people don't even begin to understand. Jesus didn't crawl out from under a rock somewhere. He wasn't a down and outer. He wasn't sleeping under the bridges. He did say he would sleep under the bridge or wherever. You know, it didn't matter. He was of the royal family of the Jews. That's why they were worried about this man. Does he want to be king? You know, he could have said, wait a bit, you know, look at my genealogy, you know, David, me, down here. When he stood in the temple and he said to the people there, you've turned my father's house into a den of robbers. Now we know he was talking about God the Father's house. How do you think the Jews would have heard that, the Jewish leaders? They didn't believe God was his father. A lot of those Jews would have realized it was his great-great-great-great-great-grandfather who built this house. That's right. Zerubbabel, the man who built that temple, was a great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Jesus. We know that. You can read that in Matthew 1. You turned my father's house into a den of thieves. I bet somebody there would have thought, yeah, that's right. Because they didn't believe God was his father. The disciples hearing that would have realized, no, he's talking about God the Father. And you and I, if we'd been there and if we understood, we would have said, oh, he's talking about God the Father. I guess I need to stop. What I wanted you to do today, more than anything else, is when we talk about holy days, we're talking about something that was instituted way back in the Old Testament, came into the New Testament. It was there when Jesus was there. The Passover lambs that were killed pictured Jesus dying. If you go back to 1 Corinthians 5, and I'll conclude with this verse that I read before, because I want you to think about something. 1 Corinthians 5. Verse 7, we read it before. Purge out therefore the leaven that you may be a new lump, as you are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. If you go back to New Testament time, you'll find that at the temple, they killed thousands of lambs, slaughtered by the priests, and taken to people's homes. Now, when I read this was written by the Apostle Paul, who before was Saul of Tarsus. Where would Paul have been? Where would Saul of Tarsus have been when the lambs were being slaughtered at the temple? If you know anything about Paul, or Saul as he was, he would have been at the temple. That's where all the devout people would have been. He would have been at the temple, and he would have seen the lambs being slaughtered. He would have seen their blood being caught in bronze bowls, carried and poured out on the altar, as the tradition of the Jews was. You can read it in the Jewish Talmud. You can read Josephus' account. Paul would have seen that. Can you imagine what it meant to him when he said, for Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us? When you read the scriptures, put yourself back in the first century. Put yourself there, standing next to Paul or Saul of Tarsus, or next to Peter, or next to John. When you read about the Last Supper, mentally put yourself in the group and hear the disciples saying, who is going to betray him? As they looked around, which one of us? And then Peter saying to John, because John was sitting next to Jesus, ask him who it is. So John leans over, because sitting right next to Jesus, and he said, Jesus, who is going to betray you? And he whispers back to John and he says, the one to whom I give the bread that I dip in the sop. And they watch, those who heard it. And Jesus reaches and takes some bread and he dips it in the gravy. And he hands it to Judas Iscariot. That's the first time the other disciples realized who the traitor was. I want you to see those things for yourself. Make this book live for you. Let's think about that as we prepare for next Sunday when we come here, and I'll try to explain very excitingly and very clearly to you why we keep a day that is called the Day of Pentecost. Thank you for listening.